At 7 o'clock in the morning on April 29, 1945, Private First Class Desmond Doss crouched at the base of a towering limestone cliff on Okinawa and watched American soldiers die on the rocks above him. He was 26 years old. He had survived 3 brutal combat campaigns in the Pacific, and he carried no weapon. Above him rose the Maeda Escarpment, a jagged wall of rock the American soldiers had already begun calling Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had spent years transforming it into a fortress. Machine gun nests were hidden throughout the cliff face. Mortar crews had pre-registered their fire on every possible approach. Underground tunnels connected dozens of reinforced bunkers across the plateau. The Americans had only one way up: cargo nets. Those nets hung against the cliff like thin threads climbing toward death. Every soldier who grabbed one and began the climb would be exposed, suspended in the open, with no cover and nowhere to hide. Desmond Doss had arrived on Okinawa with B Company of the 307th Infantry Regiment, part of the 77th Infantry Division. By the end of April, a company had already tried to take the escarpment and had been nearly wiped out in the attempt. The few men who survived were now being folded into B Company for another assault. Everyone understood the mathematics of what they were about to do. The cliff rose more than 360 feet at a brutal angle before ending in a final 35-foot vertical wall of rock. Cargo nets had been thrown over the edge to make the climb possible, but once soldiers reached the top, they would step directly into a carefully prepared kill zone. Every man climbing that rope would become a target. But Desmond Doss carried a burden none of the other soldiers could fully understand. He had no rifle, no pistol, no bayonet, no weapon of any kind. The only thing in his hands was a medic's kit, and for 3 years, many of the men around him had tried to get rid of him. The trouble had started in 1942 during basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia. His faith forbade him from killing another human being. It also forbade him from working on Saturdays, the Sabbath he observed. When he refused to pick up a rifle during training, the reaction was immediate and brutal. Other recruits saw him as a coward hiding behind religion. They mocked him openly and called him a liability who would get everyone killed. Some nights they threw boots at him while he knelt beside his bunk and prayed. The insults followed him everywhere, echoing through the barracks and across the training fields. One soldier made a promise that everyone heard. When they reached combat, he said he would make sure Desmond Doss never came back alive. His commanding officers tried to remove him from the army entirely. When that failed, they attempted to have him discharged for mental instability. When that failed too, they tried to court-martial him for refusing to handle a weapon. Eventually, the charges collapsed. But the message was clear. No one wanted Desmond Doss in their unit. No one trusted him. And no one believed a man without a gun could be anything but a burden in combat. Despite everything, Doss deployed with the 307th Infantry. The first test came on Guam in 1944. The men who had threatened him watched something unexpected unfold in the chaos of battle. The quiet, skinny kid from Virginia ran straight into enemy fire without hesitation. While bullets struck the ground around him, he dragged wounded soldiers back to safety. He carried men across open ground while machine guns fired overhead. For those actions, he earned a Bronze Star for valor. Then he earned another one in the Philippines. By the time the 77th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa, the threats had disappeared. The men around him had seen what Doss would do for them. Respect had replaced contempt. But respect did not change the tactical reality. On Hacksaw Ridge, medics were priority targets. Japanese soldiers were trained to shoot medical personnel first. Killing a medic destroyed morale and left wounded soldiers to die slowly where they fell. And Desmond Doss would be climbing that cliff with nothing but bandages and morphine. The assault was scheduled for the following morning. Doss already knew what waited at the top. Intelligence reports estimated thousands of Japanese soldiers entrenched within caves and tunnels across the escarpment. Machine guns covered every open approach. Mortar crews had carefully mapped the American climbing routes. Anyone who reached the top would be stepping into a storm of steel. But Doss carried something the other soldiers did not. During training at Fort Jackson, he had accidentally learned a knot that no one else paid attention to. It had happened while he was trying to tie a standard bowline knot. Instead of forming a single loop, he mistakenly doubled the rope while tying it, creating 2 loops instead of one. His instructors had laughed at the mistake and told him to forget it. But Doss never forgot. The knot created two secure loops. One loop could fit under a wounded soldier's arms, and the second could support his legs. The design spread the weight evenly and prevented the rope from tightening dangerously around the body. More importantly, the knot allowed one man to lower another safely down a cliff. Doss practiced tying that knot hundreds of times. He practiced it until his hands could form it without looking. The night before the assault, he sat quietly with his equipment laid out beside him. Bandages, sulfa powder, morphine syringes, plasma bottles, and a length of rope. Around him, soldiers cleaned rifles and checked grenades. They prepared to fight their way across the most heavily defended ground on Okinawa. Doss prepared to climb into it with nothing but faith, and a knot everyone had once laughed at. At dawn on May 2nd, 1945, the cargo nets went up. B Company and the remnants of a company began the climb toward the escarpment. Desmond Doss grabbed the rope net and started upward. His medic bag hung across his chest, filled with bandages and medical supplies that shifted with every movement. Soldiers around him climbed with M1 rifles strapped to their backs and grenades hanging from their belts. Doss climbed with empty hands. The double loop knot he had invented worked on a simple principle. A normal bowline created a single loop. His version doubled the rope, forming two loops that would hold a wounded soldier securely while lowering him down the cliff. It would not slip. It would not tighten, and one man could operate it alone. The climb took nearly an hour. Japanese machine gun crews waited silently while the Americans struggled up the nets. They held their fire until the first soldiers pulled themselves over the edge and onto the plateau above. Then the killing began. Artillery shells exploded across the escarpment. Mortars walked through the American positions. Machine gun fire tore into soldiers who had survived the climb only to be cut down seconds later. The plateau stretched roughly 300 yards across, scarred with shell craters and shattered trees. Hidden tunnel entrances opened between rocks and ridges. Every piece of ground concealed danger. Doss moved through the chaos without a weapon. His job was simple: find the wounded, stop the bleeding, keep them alive. Japanese snipers targeted Red Cross armbands whenever they saw them. Doss had removed his medic insignia before the assault so that he would blend in with the other soldiers. The first man he reached had taken shrapnel to the abdomen. Doss pressed bandages against the wound and poured sulfa powder into the torn flesh to prevent infection. The soldier could not be moved yet. The fighting was too intense. Doss memorized the location and moved to the next casualty. Then another. Then another. By midday, the plateau was littered with wounded Americans. Some could still fire their weapons. Others could not even crawl. The Japanese had already zeroed their mortars on the cargo net area. Any soldier trying to descend the cliff immediately drew fire. The wounded were trapped on top of the escarpment with nowhere to go. Doss kept count as he moved. 15 wounded. 20. 25. The other medics were dead or pinned down. Desmond Doss was the only medical personnel still moving freely across the plateau. His smaller frame made him a harder target, and without the weight of a rifle, he could move faster than the soldiers around him. But as the afternoon wore on, the situation grew worse. Japanese reinforcements began emerging from tunnels behind the American lines. Machine guns opened fire from positions the soldiers thought they had already cleared. The enemy seemed to appear from the ground itself, firing, disappearing, then returning somewhere else. By evening, the company commander faced the decision no officer ever wanted to make. They could not hold the plateau through the night. Japanese infiltrators would pick them off in the darkness. The order was given to withdraw back down the cargo nets. Able-bodied soldiers began descending the cliff, but dozens of wounded men still lay scattered across the escarpment. Desmond Doss watched the retreat begin. He knew exactly what happened to American soldiers captured by Japanese forces. Torture, execution, bodies mutilated as warnings to others. The men lying wounded around him were the same soldiers who had thrown boots at him during training. The same men who had threatened to kill him. The same men who had called him a coward. Doss did not climb down the cargo nets. He stayed on the escarpment, alone, unarmed, surrounded by enemy soldiers emerging from their tunnels. And he had a rope. The first wounded man Desmond Doss reached weighed nearly twice as much as he did. The soldier had taken machine gun rounds through both legs. Blood soaked through his uniform and pooled beneath him in the dirt. He could not walk. He could not crawl. Without help, he would bleed out where he lay, or be found by Japanese patrols sweeping the escarpment after dark. Doss pulled the rope from his medic bag and searched the cliff edge for something solid enough to hold a man's weight. He found it in the remains of a shattered tree stump. Artillery had splintered the trunk down to a jagged core, but its roots were still buried deep in the earth. Doss wrapped the rope around it twice. Then he tied his knot, the double bowline. 2 loops formed quickly beneath his hands. 1 loop for the wounded soldier's arms and chest, the second to support his legs. It was simple, fast, and strong enough to hold a man's full weight without tightening dangerously around his body. Doss dragged the wounded soldier to the cliff edge. The man groaned in pain as Doss positioned him in the improvised harness. Below them, the escarpment dropped 35 feet straight down into darkness. Doss could not see the ground. He could only trust that medics were waiting at the base of the cliff. Then he began lowering the rope. The man's weight pulled hard against the stump anchor. The rough manila rope slid through Doss's hands as he carefully fed it downward, controlling the descent inch by inch. The wounded soldier swung slightly against the cliff face as he descended, scraping against the rock. Doss could not see what was happening below. He could only feel the tension in the rope and pray the knot held. Then suddenly, the weight disappeared. Hands below had caught the soldier. Medics at the base of the cliff pulled him free from the harness. Doss hauled the rope back up hand over hand and immediately began searching for the next casualty. The second evacuation went faster. He now understood how much rope to feed and how quickly the descent could be controlled. But by the third rescue, a new problem appeared. His hands were bleeding. The rope had torn the skin from his palms. Every descent burned like fire as the rough fibers dragged across open flesh. By the fourth rescue, the rope was slick with his own blood. Doss tore strips from the undershirt beneath his uniform and wrapped them around his hands before continuing. The Japanese had not yet discovered what he was doing. Darkness concealed his movements along the cliff edge. The wounded soldiers were scattered across nearly 300 yards of plateau. Doss had to search for them, drag them across broken ground, rig the harness, lower them down, and then haul the rope back up again. Each rescue took 15 to 20 minutes. Find a casualty, treat the wounds, drag him to the cliff, tie the bowline, lower him down, pull the rope back up, then start again. The physical toll was enormous. Doss had not eaten since morning. He had been awake for nearly an entire day. His arms trembled from exhaustion every time he finished lowering another man. By midnight, he had already saved more than a dozen soldiers. His hands were raw flesh wrapped in bloody cloth. His shoulders burned from hauling the rope again and again. But the plateau still held wounded men he had not reached. Some lay inside shell craters. Others had crawled into depressions in the ground to hide from Japanese patrols. Doss moved slowly through the darkness, feeling for bodies with his hands and listening for breathing. The success of his rescues created a new danger. Japanese soldiers began to notice something strange. American wounded who had been lying on the plateau were disappearing. Enemy patrols started searching the cliff edge. They knew someone was still up there. They just had not found him yet. Doss heard them before he saw them. Voices speaking Japanese somewhere in the darkness. He flattened himself against the ground and stopped breathing. A patrol moved across the plateau, less than 20 yards from where he lay. Flashlights swept through the night, beams sliding across craters and broken trees. If they discovered him, he had no weapon to defend himself. He could only remain still and hope. The patrol continued past him and disappeared toward the northern edge of the escarpment. Doss waited until the lights faded. Then he resumed his work. But every rescue now carried greater risk. The Japanese knew something was happening. They would be watching the cliff, listening for rope sliding across rock, searching for the American who had been stealing their prisoners. Doss found another wounded soldier near the remains of a destroyed machine gun position. The man had taken shrapnel across his chest and abdomen. He was conscious but too weak to move. Doss began dragging him toward the cliff. 50 yards. The ground was uneven and littered with debris. Doss pulled with his legs, keeping low, inching across the dirt. Then suddenly, a flare shot into the sky. White phosphorus light exploded across the plateau. Doss froze. He was completely exposed. 30 yards from the cliff edge, a wounded soldier beneath him. Japanese soldiers watching from every direction. The flare burned for 30 seconds. Doss pressed his face into the dirt and did not move. The wounded soldier beneath him groaned softly. Any sound could betray them. Doss clamped his blood-soaked hand over the man's mouth and waited. Japanese soldiers scanned the plateau under the harsh white light. Their silhouettes moved slowly along defensive positions as they searched for movement. They were looking for him. The flare sputtered, then died. Darkness returned. Doss counted slowly to 60 before moving again. His arms had stopped shaking. They had gone numb. Exhaustion had pushed beyond pain into something deeper, something automatic. He moved now on instinct. Find the wounded. Drag them to safety. Lower them down. Repeat. When he reached the cliff edge again, he saw something that changed everything. Japanese soldiers were examining the tree stump where he had anchored his rope. They had found it. They could see the rope marks carved into the bark, the disturbed ground where wounded soldiers had been dragged. They knew exactly what had been happening, and now they would be hunting him. Doss could not use that location again. He crawled along the cliff edge searching for another anchor point. The escarpment was uneven, broken by ledges and outcroppings that could snag a descending body. He needed a clear drop and something solid to tie the rope. 50 yards south, he found a rock formation jutting from the edge. It was smaller than the stump, but firmly embedded in the ground. Doss tested it with his full weight. The rock did not move. He wrapped the rope around its base and prepared for another rescue. The wounded soldier he had been dragging still lay 30 yards away. Doss crawled back to retrieve him. Every yard felt like a mile. His knees were torn open from crawling across broken ground. His hands left bloody streaks across the dirt. The cost of every rescue was growing heavier. But he kept moving. 20 yards. 15. 10. Another flare shot into the sky. This time the light illuminated the original evacuation point. Doss watched Japanese soldiers inspecting the tree stump, studying the marks in the bark and the trail of disturbed earth. They had finally understood. They were looking for the man responsible. The flare faded. Doss finished dragging the wounded soldier to the new anchor point and lowered him down the cliff. When the rope went slack again, he pulled it back up. Every movement now hurt. The muscles in his arms cramped into knots. His shoulders felt as if they were tearing apart. He had been working for more than 6 hours. And dawn was approaching. The darkness that had protected him would soon disappear. When the sun rose, every movement across the plateau would be visible. Doss stopped and counted. Somewhere between 30 and 40 men had already been lowered to safety. But more were still out there. He could hear them in the darkness. Weak voices calling for help. Moans of pain drifting across the battlefield. The numbers no longer made sense. Each rescue took 15 to 20 minutes. Dawn was less than 2 hours away. Even if he worked without stopping, he could only save 6 or 8 more men. The rest would be left behind. Left for the Japanese. Doss knelt quietly beside the cliff. For a moment he prayed. The same words repeated again and again. Not for strength. Not for safety. Only one request. Lord, help me get one more. Then Desmond Doss stood up and went back to work. At 5:47 in the morning on May 3, 1945, the first sunlight reached the top of Hacksaw Ridge. The plateau was covered with destruction. Shell craters, broken equipment, bodies of American and Japanese soldiers scattered across 300 yards of shattered ground. And one medic, still working at the edge of the cliff. Doss had not stopped. All night long he had repeated the same pattern. Find the wounded. Drag them to the rope. Tie the double bowline. Lower them down. Pull the rope back up. Again, and again, and again. His hands had stopped bleeding hours earlier, because there was almost no skin left. The wounds on Desmond Doss's hands had hardened into thick scabs that cracked open every time he gripped the rope. He no longer felt the pain. He barely felt his hands at all. The only thing he felt now was the pull of the rope and the weight of each wounded man descending slowly into safety below the cliff. When the first light of morning began to creep across Hacksaw Ridge, it should have meant his death. Daylight exposed everything. Japanese snipers positioned across the escarpment could now see every movement along the cliff edge. Mortar crews could track him easily. Machine gunners had clear lines of fire toward the evacuation point. But something strange happened as the sunlight spread across the plateau. The Japanese guns remained silent. The enemy soldiers had watched him throughout the night. From their tunnels and firing positions, they had seen the lone American medic crawling through the darkness, dragging wounded soldiers twice his size across the battlefield. They had watched him work for hours without stopping. without a weapon, without protection. Some accounts later suggested the Japanese soldiers held their fire out of respect for what they had witnessed. Others argued that the confusion of battle prevented them from understanding exactly what was happening. The truth would never be fully known. What mattered was simple. Desmond Doss kept working. By 7 o'clock in the morning, more than 50 wounded soldiers had already been lowered down the cliff. At the base of the escarpment, medics struggled to keep up with the casualties arriving one after another. They had no idea who was sending them down. All they knew was that wounded Americans kept appearing at the end of a rope harness descending from somewhere high above them. Doss moved again across the plateau. Near the eastern edge of the battlefield, he found another wounded soldier lying half inside a shallow foxhole. The man had crawled there during the night and passed out from blood loss. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. Doss quickly bandaged the wounds and prepared to move him. The evacuation point was nearly 80 yards away. In daylight, across open ground, the Japanese soldiers could clearly see him now. Still, they did not fire. The wounded soldier weighed nearly 200 pounds. Doss weighed 145. Under normal conditions, the task would have been nearly impossible. Dragging a man heavier than himself across rough terrain required strength Doss should not have possessed after a night without food or sleep. But something inside him had pushed beyond normal limits. He no longer thought about distance or effort. Every rescue ended the same way. Lower the rope. Watch the man disappear into safety. Then whisper the same words to himself. Just one more. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the number of rescued soldiers climbed higher. 60, then 65, then 70. At the base of the cliff, the soldiers finally began to understand what was happening above them. One man, one medic, no weapon. An entire night of rescues. The soldiers who had once thrown boots at Desmond Doss during training were now being carried to safety by the same hands that had refused to hold a rifle. The final rescue came shortly before 10 o'clock that morning. Doss found the last wounded soldier still alive on the plateau and dragged him slowly to the rope anchor. He secured the double bowline around the man's body and lowered him carefully down the cliff. When the rope finally went slack again, Doss pulled it back up for the last time. Then he collapsed. His arms refused to move. His legs no longer responded. He lay against the edge of the cliff where any Japanese soldier could have killed him with a single rifle shot. None of them fired. The official number of men he rescued that night would be debated for years. Doss himself believed he had saved around 50. His commanding officer insisted the number was closer to 100. They eventually settled on 75. But the exact number mattered less than the reality. A single unarmed soldier had rescued nearly an entire company of wounded men from a position that should have been a slaughterhouse. Below the escarpment, soldiers looked up toward the ridge. They could see Doss lying motionless against the sky. Word spread quickly through the battalion. The conscientious objector, the coward, the man they had once tried to have discharged for mental instability. He had saved them, all of them. But Desmond Doss's war was not finished. After resting only a few hours and eating his first meal in more than 30 hours, he climbed the cargo nets again and returned to the top of Hacksaw Ridge. The battle was still raging. Japanese forces remained entrenched within the tunnel network beneath the escarpment, and American casualties continued to mount. B Company still needed its medic. Stories of the night rescue spread rapidly throughout the 307th Infantry Regiment. Soldiers who had not witnessed it heard the details from those who had. 75 men, lowered down a cliff by one unarmed medic. The man who had been mocked in basic training had done something no one could explain. But the days that followed proved that Hacksaw Ridge had not been a single miracle. It was only part of a pattern. On May 2nd, Doss exposed himself to heavy rifle and mortar fire to rescue a wounded soldier 200 yards in front of American lines. Under fire that should have killed them both, he dragged the casualty back across open ground to safety. 2 days later, 4 American soldiers were cut down while assaulting a Japanese cave position. The enemy was entrenched less than 8 yards away, throwing grenades into the American position. No one could reach the wounded. Doss went anyway. He moved through exploding grenades, dressed their wounds under fire, and carried each of the 4 soldiers back to safety in separate trips. On May 5th, the fighting intensified again. An artillery officer was struck by shell fragments and small arms fire. Doss crawled through the bombardment to reach him, bandaged the wounds, and administered plasma while mortar rounds exploded only yards away. Later that same day, another soldier fell 25 feet from a Japanese cave position after being shot. Enemy riflemen watched the ground around him carefully. Doss crawled forward anyway. He treated the wounded man almost within arm's reach of the enemy, then carried him 100 yards back to safety under continuous fire. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Desmond Doss had not performed a single act of courage on Hacksaw Ridge. He had demonstrated weeks of relentless bravery. Every day brought new rescues. Every day brought new wounded men who would have died without him. The medic who refused to carry a weapon repeatedly went where armed soldiers would not. His reputation transformed completely inside the 77th Infantry Division. The soldiers who once doubted him began requesting him specifically. When patrols moved forward, they wanted Doss with them. When assaults were planned, commanders asked if the medic from B Company would be there. The man they had once tried to remove from the army had become one of its most valuable soldiers. Officers began documenting his actions. Reports moved up the chain of command. Company level, battalion, regiment, division. Witness statements and casualty reports piled up, describing the actions of a soldier whose courage challenged the Army's understanding of combat. A man who refused to kill was saving more lives than anyone who carried a weapon. And somewhere inside those reports was the beginning of something Desmond Doss had never asked for. The highest honor the Army could give. But first, his war had one final test. On the night of May 21st, Doss's unit launched another assault near the Japanese stronghold of Shuri. The attack collapsed almost immediately. American soldiers walked straight into a hidden enemy force waiting in the darkness. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the hillside as grenades exploded and rifle fire flashed through the night. Doss moved through the chaos, searching for the wounded. Eventually, he dropped into a shell crater with 3 other soldiers. They crouched together in the hole, waiting for the gunfire to pass over them. Then a Japanese grenade landed beside them. Doss saw it first. The grenade arced through the darkness and dropped into the crater at his feet. There was no time to throw the grenade back. No time to shout a warning. Desmond Doss saw the small dark shape drop into the shell hole and reacted on instinct. He kicked his left foot toward where he believed the grenade had landed and pressed his helmet into the dirt. The explosion lifted him off the ground. When he hit the earth again, he immediately understood what had happened. His legs were destroyed. 17 pieces of shrapnel had ripped through his lower body, tearing into his hips and thighs. Blood poured through his uniform and soaked into the ground beneath him. The pain was immense, but even through the shock, Doss noticed something remarkable. The 3 soldiers in the shell hole with him were unharmed. His body had absorbed the blast. Alone in the darkness, Doss treated his own wounds. With hands that had already been torn apart from hours of rope work on Hacksaw Ridge, he wrapped bandages around the worst injuries and tightened makeshift tourniquets to slow the bleeding. He could have called for another medic, but he refused. Calling for help would have placed another man in danger. So Doss stayed where he was, lying in the shell hole for 5 long hours, bleeding quietly while the sounds of combat raged around him. Gradually, the gunfire faded as dawn approached. After sunrise, litter bearers finally reached his position. They lifted him onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward the battalion aid station. Then the battlefield erupted again. Japanese tanks launched a sudden counterattack. The evacuation team dove for cover as shells exploded nearby. While lying on the stretcher, Doss noticed another wounded soldier on the ground beside them. The man had been hit even worse than he had. Without hesitation, Doss rolled off the stretcher. Ignoring the wounds in his own legs, he crawled to the injured soldier and began treating him. After bandaging the man's wounds, he told the litter bearers to take that soldier first. He would wait. The stretcher team carried the other man away toward the aid station. Doss remained behind, alone on the battlefield, bleeding from 17 separate shrapnel wounds. He waited, but help did not arrive first. A sniper found him. The bullet struck his wrist, passed through his elbow, and lodged in his upper arm. The impact shattered the bone instantly, leaving his arm useless. Now Doss had 17 pieces of shrapnel in his legs and a compound fracture in his arm. He was alone, 300 yards from the aid station. Nearby, he spotted something lying in the dirt. A broken rifle. The same weapon he had refused to touch throughout his entire military career. Doss picked it up, not to fight, but to survive. Using the rifle stock, he fashioned a crude splint to stabilize his shattered arm. Then, with his legs torn apart and his arm barely functional, Desmond Doss began crawling 300 yards across rough terrain, dragging his broken body across the ground while blood continued to seep from his wounds. Inch by inch, he pulled himself forward. Eventually, he reached the aid station under his own power. At first, the army believed he had died. The report traveled all the way back to his hometown of Lynchburg, Virginia, where newspapers printed his name on the front page among the fallen. Doss corrected the mistake himself. From a hospital ship in the Pacific, he wrote a letter to his mother. He was alive. Barely. 4 months later, on October 12, 1945, Corporal Desmond Doss stood on the White House lawn in Washington, D.C. President Harry Truman held the Medal of Honor in his hands. The official citation described actions spanning weeks of brutal combat, from April 29 to May 21 on Okinawa. It told of the rescues on Hacksaw Ridge, the wounded soldiers dragged from under enemy fire, the cave assaults, and the grenade that should have killed 4 men. Truman placed the medal around Doss's neck and shook his hand. Then he said something that surprised everyone present. He told Doss the honor of presenting the medal was greater than being President of the United States. Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor for combat actions. The soldier who refused to carry a weapon had earned the nation's highest military decoration. But the men of the 307th Infantry Regiment had something else to give him. During the battle, Doss had lost the small Bible he carried everywhere. After the fighting ended, members of his unit returned to the escarpment. They searched the battlefield until they found it. Then they returned it to the man who had saved their lives. The war left permanent scars on Desmond Doss. The shrapnel wounds eventually healed, and the shattered arm required extensive surgery. But the most serious damage came from an illness he had unknowingly carried through the fighting: tuberculosis. The infection had spread through his lungs during the Okinawa campaign. By the time doctors diagnosed it, the disease had caused irreversible damage. Doss spent more than 5 years recovering in army hospitals after the war. Eventually, surgeons removed one of his lungs entirely. The operation saved his life, but it left him permanently disabled. When he finally returned home to Lynchburg, Virginia, he carried the Medal of Honor, a Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, 2 bronze stars, and a body that would never fully recover. His injuries made regular work difficult. The man who had dragged soldiers twice his weight across a battlefield could no longer perform heavy labor. Yet Doss never complained. He moved to a small farm in Rising Fawn, Georgia with his wife Dorothy. They had married shortly before he left for the Pacific, and she had given him the Bible he carried through every battle. The same Bible his fellow soldiers had searched for on Hacksaw Ridge. He kept it for the rest of his life. The farm became his quiet refuge. Doss worked when his body allowed and rested when it did not. He remained deeply active in his Seventh-day Adventist Church, the faith that had guided every decision of his military service. The same beliefs that had once made him a target for ridicule had also made him a hero. For decades, he lived quietly, rarely speaking about the war. Occasionally, he would give talks to church groups, scouts, and veterans organizations. Sometimes he demonstrated the double bowline knot, the same knot that had lowered 75 men down a cliff on Okinawa. But he never sought recognition. He never wrote his own book. Whenever people praised him, he redirected the attention toward the soldiers who had not come home. Dorothy died in 1991 after a tragic car accident. 2 years later, Doss remarried. His second wife, Frances Duman, cared for him during the final years of his life as his health slowly declined. For decades, filmmakers tried to tell his story. Producers approached him repeatedly. Even Audie Murphy, another Medal of Honor recipient and Hollywood actor, once wanted to bring the story to the screen. Doss refused every offer. He feared his experiences would be exaggerated or sensationalized. Only when he finally found filmmakers he trusted did he agree to share his story publicly. In 2004, a documentary titled The Conscientious Objector introduced his experiences to a wider audience. For the first time, Doss described events he had kept private for nearly 60 years. Even then, his humility never changed. He still insisted the true heroes were the men who never returned home. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old. 10 years later, The feature film Hacksaw Ridge brought his story to millions of people around the world. The film won Academy Awards and earned more than $180 million at the box office. Doss never saw it, but his legacy had finally reached the world. Today, monuments stand in his honor at the National Museum of the United States Army and on Okinawa itself at the Maeda Escarpment. The same cliff he climbed. The same plateau where he saved 75 men. The ground that should have become his grave instead became his memorial.